Welcome. My name is Carol Leonard again, and I'm here representing the Center for Russian Studies in the Institute of Social Sciences at Rajnepa. And our co-sponsor for these events, Vasily Zharkov, was here yesterday, political science faculty at Rajnepa, and especially the political science research going on in the Institute for the Social Sciences. Briefly, I know most of you were here before, but just in case you weren't, these are a series of 3 lectures which will be available by disc on political science methods, research design, and finally this evening's presentation, the research itself, for which William Raizinger from the University of Iowa is being brought here. He's a major scholar, and very kindly agreed to give methodological background and introduction to what he teaches, as well as present his own research. And for those who are interested, those who probably most of you are not, but if any of you are interested in getting a certificate from this, I'd be glad to work with you further. And we then, to you, distribute a certificate in the month of December for повышение квалификации. Without further ado, let me then again introduce Bill Raizinger, who is a major political scientist, as I suggested, and has written numerous books and many other works on post-communist politics, in particular Central and East Europe, Uzbekistan, Ukraine, but especially in particular Russia. As a regional economist myself, I'm pretty excited to hear his talk on subnational democratic values and their impact on Russian regional politics. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Carol. Thanks again for this opportunity to meet with everyone and to talk about my research today, which I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments and questions about what I'm doing. So anyway, when I finish presenting my works, I hope you will be able to pose some questions to not just to help you understand what I presented, but questions that will shed light for me on maybe what my findings suggest. Because in terms of what I talked about yesterday of having a research question and hopefully a puzzle that you can pursue in your research to try to answer, one of the things about this project that I'm going to talk about today is I began with a question that I did not think was puzzling necessarily. It wasn't something that struck me as a puzzle, as something very surprising given what we already know. But by the end of the research, now I'm puzzled. So I do have a puzzle at the end. So this is something that will require further research that I will do in part, but others will need to do as well. So let me tell you a little bit about my question and my research project that I'm going to discuss today. The subnational part refers to the 83 regions that make up the Russian Federation, and they are good from my point of view. They're a very good place to study to make comparisons among different political sites, different political units, because they all are within one country. And so many things that might be difficult to compare if you were looking at different countries are all the same for these different units. So for all 83 regions, Constitution is the same, the federal rules are the same, etc. Right? They're all part of one country. And that actually makes it very useful, because then the things that do distinguish them sort of rise in terms of their importance in explaining differences in the regions. And of course, we know that the regions in Russia are very different from each other. You won't be surprised to know that the different parts that make up Russia are in many ways very different economically, socially, etc. Okay, so those differences give us important and interesting things to work with. So I'm doing comparative politics, but within a single country. Okay, so to do that, you move down from the country level to the subnational level. Okay, and so that's the idea. I'm doing this, I should say, by the way, as you can see there, with a colleague, a co-author who is also works with me at the University of Iowa, and she is a specialist in studying the American states. Okay, so in a similar way to my interest in comparing differences across Russia's regions, she is interested in comparing differences across American states. So she has some valuable training that I found very useful in doing this study. Okay, so the topic is democratic values, and the question is, do the people, the questions maybe that motivate the study, do the people in the different regions think about things in different ways that are important for politics? Okay, so are the people of Tomsk in some way in how they think about politics, what they want from their leaders, what they value, and what they consider to be good policy and bad policy, any and all of those kind of things, public opinion. Is it importantly different in Tomsk and Khabarovsk and on and on, right? Are the differences across there something that have real political impact? Okay, so that's an important question that I think still, with regard to Russia, we don't know enough about. There's much more to learn about that. A second related question is, do the public, the members of the public, non-elites, okay, people who are regular citizens, do they matter in the course of change for any political unit? To what extent do the people matter, as opposed to the leaders and the elites? Okay. So when I talk about democratic values, that is the idea that for democratic political practices and institutions to function well, there is a theory that people should want certain kinds of politics, should expect the relationship between the public and the leaders to have certain forms and not others. Or else the democratic institutions will not last long, they won't function well, they may never get accepted. We should expect to find democracy, according to this one kind of perspective on it. We should expect to find democracy in places where the society, the people who live in that country, want democracy. So that's the idea of democratic values. Are there ways of thinking that people in some places in the world have, and maybe in other places they don't have? And that's why we should expect democracy to operate in certain places and not in others. Because the ordinary people of the society have certain kinds of outlooks or views or opinions that make democracy the right way to run the country. Whereas in other places, because the people think about politics in different ways, democracy is not the right way to run the country. And I want to specify about that idea that when scholars talk about democratic values, they do not just mean the question of, do you like democracy? Although that can be a useful question to ask people. There are several reasons why that alone is not a good enough indicator of democratic values. For one thing, democracy can be very popular in some places, but because people don't really know what it means other than it seems like something good, they say, yes, I'm for democracy. But as scholars, it's very hard to tell, well, what is it that they really want? Secondly, in some other places, democracy is very unpopular for reasons that don't have anything to do with politics or that don't have anything to do with democracy itself. So that question alone isn't good enough. We usually, those who study democratic values in any country, usually ask several questions when they do opinion surveys to get a gauge of which people are really more supportive of democracy and which are not. And I will show you in a minute which questions I'm using to measure democratic values. Okay, so there are 5 questions actually that I use. One of them is in fact to ask about democracy and what people think about it, but the others are not. Okay. And so as you probably understand, I'm going to be using information that's quantitative and that comes from public opinion surveys taken in Russia that went out, the interviewers went out and asked Russians, all representative of the entire country, questions about politics. Okay, and then based on their answers to that, I am selecting some people as being supportive of democracy. Okay, and if you think back to my first lecture, then that falls into a particular theoretical approach, one of the theoretical approaches I talked about, which is behavioralism. This is a quantitative behavioral approach I'm taking. That it matters how many of which kind of people are in each region, right? And that I think that in each region it's the total number of people who hold certain views as opposed to others who hold different views within the region. And those combinations of people are what matters. So I'm thinking about this like a behavioralist. Okay? And I'm using survey research, which is a very common tool for those who do behavioral political science research. And in some sense, I'm talking about political culture, right? But I'm doing it by counting up whether there's a lot of people who have democratic values or not very many people in each of the different regions. Okay. So those are some foregrounds. Before I go on, let me tell you what I find. Okay. What I'm going to show you, I hope, by the end of the talk, is that the places in Russia, the regions, the locations, these political units that make up the federation, when there are a lot of people who support democratic values in a region, that means it's more likely that the region was democratic in the 1990s, that is in the first decade after the independence of the Russian Federation. Okay. So all else held equal, the public in these places, if they had democratic values, that made them more likely to have a democratic political regime in the region during that period in the 1990s. However, other factors, other characteristics of the region were actually stronger, and they pushed in the other direction. So it is the case that a public that holds democratic values, I think this is my conclusion, it is the case that if the people in a region thought democracy was good, had certain ways of thinking about politics that were pro-democratic, that made it harder for the regional leaderships to gain firm control and create a strong political machine that eliminated political competition in the region. And so there was more democracy in those places. But there's other things going on as well. And it actually, if you don't control for multiple different influences, you could find that the regions with high democratic values also were low on democracy. Okay. And so that's kind of the puzzle. All right, so let me explain what I did, how I reached that conclusion, and maybe you can give me some insights. I'm showing here in very simple form the ideas that I have, the arguments that I will make about what causes what. the box on the far left, regional characteristics, that could in principle be many things. Could be such things as where the region is located, what kind of people live there, level of economic development, etc. Those are some of the things that I focused on. The top middle box is the public opinion or political culture of the region with regard to democratic values. Regional level of mass support. Mass means mass public, the ordinary people, the non-elites. Okay, so the level of that in that region of support for democratic values among all the people of the region. And then the influence that those things have on political outcomes. And I studied two kinds of political outcomes that I will share with you today. One is voting results in federal presidential elections, and the other is a measure of regional democracy. And as you see from the arrows, my theory is that people's attitudes, people's views, the political culture, are influenced by characteristics of the region, socioeconomic, demographic characteristics, and that both the regional characteristics, but also the public opinion, the public values, they both affect the outcomes. Okay, so this is a little bit more complicated path here. Okay. So that's my basic model. Right? The story is that in a given region, if the public, at the time of the end of the Soviet Union and the starting of new political forces, new political patterns in each region, and the attempt of governors to set up new power structures, etc., during that period in the 1990s, when things were changing, some regions had had real political openness and competition among groups or factions within it. Elections were important, and we didn't know who would win. Whereas in other regions, there was a political boss who had, a pretty strong machine even before the end of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union ended, and that machine just continued. And there really was no question that one leader was in charge. Okay? And so those kind of different situations, right, could in part be explained by the public, the people, and their views. Maybe not. Maybe you're cynical. I know a lot of my friends at home in America would go, the public doesn't matter. It's all just about politicians, and they don't pay any attention to the public. But, there's a big branch of political science that suggests that that's not in fact true. Political leaders can do their work only in interaction with a broader public, and so what that broader public thinks really matters. So that's my goal, is to test some of these kind of things. As I mentioned earlier, the basic material that I'm working with comes from public opinion surveys. Okay, and both public opinion surveys were done in the middle of the 1990s. I apologize for the small print on some of those, so take your time and look at it. The two studies, one was done a part of a team that I was involved with, that we commissioned public opinion survey in Russia. That was conducted in 1997, and the other was conducted by two other American political scientists, and conducted in 1995 and 1996. It was actually a series of surveys before the legislative elections, parliamentary elections in 95, after the parliamentary elections, but before the presidential elections, and then after the presidential elections. So they had a variety of, or they had this panel of surveys. there were overlapping questions that they asked. The first question here did indeed ask about democracy, whether people like democracy. I don't know, some of you may have seen 2 days ago, I believe, the Levada Center released a survey that showed that I think 60% of Russians like the idea of democracy, support that Russia needs democracy, демократия нужна России. I don't know if anybody see that survey. So one of the interesting things about that was then a second question asked, do you support democracy as it is in Western Europe and the United States? And 55% of the people who were being interviewed said no. Okay, so 60% of Russians support democracy, but 55% say not democracy as it's practiced in those countries that are the older democracies. Which means that it's a complicated question. At the very least, right? Democracy is a complicated concept. If you just ask people, do you like democracy? It's very hard to interpret what the answers mean. So our question, though, has in it the alternatives. We actually asked people, which of these three do you like better? So if they picked answer number 3, a Western-style democracy, they were already in that small group that was choosing that particular kind of outcome. And that's the group, the ones who selected option number 3, that I scored as having democratic values. But as I said, that one question by itself is not enough. I also wanted to know other things about each person we interviewed. And so the other questions ask about aspects of democracy or the process of democratic politics, competition among multiple parties. Remember, in the 1990s, multiple party competition was new in Russia. There was only one party ever voted for during the Soviet Union. So asking this question of whether it is important to have a choice between more than one party was something that was new and people were reacting to. Compromise with political opponents. This is a question that's asked in many surveys around the world because it relates to the idea that even if you don't like those in power, you allow them to hold power temporarily until the next election. And that those in power will compromise with those out, and that democratic politics will allow for alternation in power. Fourth question was about the public's right to initiate opposition to those in power. And then the final one was this question about actually doing something politically besides voting. Because one of the democratic values that seems to be associated with people who want a democracy as a form of government is the idea that the people should be active. Even in between elections, that the public should speak out and make their views known and be active in trying to tell their government how to behave. Right? That that's a form of rule by the people. So these were 5 questions asked in some combination of the 2 studies. We put together the different studies to get more respondents, more coverage of different parts of Russia. We went through a special technique using information about each region from the census on their age, educational characteristics, sex characteristics, male, female, and ethnic characteristics. And we found all that information out for each of the regions and went through a complicated process of estimating based on these questions how many people in each region held these pro-democratic kind of values. Now, I'm not, in the main part of my talk, I'm not going to take you through that process of making the regional estimates because it's complicated and it would take a long time. Please ask me about it if you would like in the question period. Okay, so the idea is, though, for each region, we were able to make estimates of what proportion of the region had people who answered these questions in certain ways. I then combined those answers, that information for each region, into one number. That is, I took a number, I made a variable that put all that information together. So it's a variable that ranges from negative 2 point something to positive 3 point something, and the average is 0. And for each region, they have one number on that variable. High positive numbers mean a lot of people in the region support democratic values. Negative numbers mean below average number of people support democratic values. So I'm going to show you results about that variable. Okay, high numbers mean in the region, the public as a whole tended back then in the 90s to have lots of people who thought about politics in ways that support democracy. Okay. Other regions, the numbers were low. So that's the number I'm going to show you now. And I have it in the form of this map. I think that will be meaningful for you. Darker colors, you can see the scale on the right. Darker colors indicate higher democratic values, higher support for democratic values. Right. Now, it's hard to see, but what probably won't surprise you is it's a high score in Moscow, high score in St. Petersburg. Maybe this will surprise you, but there's a very high score in Kabardino-Balkaria. Khabarovsk. I've never been to Khabarovsk, I don't know it very well, but I was a little surprised by that. And then other places have high scores, others have very low scores, and you see these patterns. Okay. The average is negative 1.33 to positive 2. The range, excuse me, the average is 0. These are the two highest scoring regions. Kabardino-Balkaria, their score is 2.02. Moscow is second place and it's only 1.45. A very high score in Kabardino-Balkaria on these things. The low regions are Kursk and Pskov. I don't know, again, I don't really know. Maybe some of you have a feeling for why those two regions might have very few people with democratic values. Think about that. I just don't know them well enough as regions. Both are located in the West, very close to West European countries. So that might seem to suggest that there would be a more pro-democratic populace, but it's not the case. Yes, question.
Where you have found this information, this map?
Well, I made the map, or actually someone made it for me. All the numbers that the colors indicate are the result of me taking the survey questions and putting them together into this scale, right? And then I told someone to turn it into a map of the regions. You can download the information of how to build the map. There's a software program that makes the map, and it uses GIS to determine the regions and then fill it in. So if you're asking about the map itself, the answer is there is a mapping program, a software program. If you're asking about the numbers, they're my calculations based on public opinion. Yeah. So we can come back to that. I was also curious about groupings, the location of these regions, and whether those regions that are in the same neighborhood tended to have certain characteristics, whether it was important where they were. And of course, one way to think about location in the Russian Federation is through the federal okrugs, the federal administrative districts. And so just the average of this variable, the region, the okrug with the highest average score on democratic values, thanks largely to Kabardino-Balkaria, I think, is the North Caucasus. Now you're going to say to yourselves, I know many of you are saying to yourselves, the state of democracy in the North Caucasus is maybe not the greatest. Right, okay, so, but I warned you already at the beginning that this ends with a puzzle. Okay, and the central, home to Moscow, is the lowest on average. So Moscow City, very high levels of support for democratic values, but there's quite a bit of yellow around it. Okay. So, are there other questions to clarify the map before I go on? So this is what this map shows you in the previous slide is the top middle box. Okay, so the top middle box in the previous slide about mass values, support for democratic values. For the rest of the way, what I'm going to talk about is the relationship between these numbers and other things, regional characteristics and political outcomes. Please.
One question. Have you compared this map with the map of voting for different parties? Because, for example, those yellow regions to the south of Moscow, yes, this one, that was known as the so-called red belt.
Right.
Yes, this is the red belt, and the red belt was the most depressive regions. And those to the east that are shown as the most pro-democratic. They basically tended to vote for so-called liberal democratic party that was not neither liberal nor democratic. It was an almost fascist hardliner party. But those regions did not have stable political machine, while Moscow and St. Petersburg had a very strong political machine, and the results of the local elections were usually predicted. So the question is, have you compared this map with the map of voting?
So I will be showing you in a minute how this relates to voting in 1996 for the presidential election. So Yeltsin versus Zyuganov. And of course that's very important, and you're right, yeah, the so-called red belt regions are very important here. I want to hear more about the other things. At the end, let's think about that more. I think that's a very important part of this.
Can I ask that we hold questions until after the talk is over?
So I wondered if there were technical things, but let me move on now. Okay, so I'm going to now show you some results for the relationship between regional characteristics and those values in the map. Okay, so I just want to share with you a little bit of what might be going on there, what might be causing some regions to have higher levels of public support for democratic values. And one of the things that anyone who's studied Russia's regions will tell you very quickly is you should first look at those regions that are what I usually call ethnic regions, that is, the republics and autonomous regions that are named after a titular ethnic group, a non-Russian ethnic group. So here, republics and autonomous oblasts, in distinction or in contrast to the rest of the regions, which are the 2 cities of federal stature and the oblasts and krais. Okay, so just as a very basic first distinction, right, anyone who has puzzling information about the regions would want to know, okay, how does this differ between those 2 groups? So as you saw on the map, excuse me, this is the range and average for the variable for all the data. Okay, this is exactly what you saw on the previous slide. But now for the republics and autonomous regions, the average is 0.29 positive, but for the others it's negative. On average, in other words, the most democratic regions, the regions with the most democratic publics in Russia, I don't want to say the most democratic regions, I want to say the regions whose publics seem to hold the most democratic values during this period based on our calculations are the republics and autonomous regions. They are the ethnic regions, not the oblasts and krais. Again, this is not what I would have expected going in. I don't know, what your prior thoughts would have been, but there you have it. So 0.29 positive plus 0.29 versus negative 0.13. In Moscow is one of the highest scoring there. Erskine go for low, as we saw before. Okay. So somehow or other, on this measure of support for democratic values, it is not the primarily ethnically Russian regions that are having the highest scores. This is the results of doing a multivariate regression to try to show the relationship between several types of regional characteristics and high or low scores on democratic values. Forgive me for all this kind of jumble of numbers. It can be kind of confusing. I want to draw your attention to these numbers over here. For those numbers, bigger means they have a more powerful impact. They correlate more strongly with the democratic values while controlling for the other things. Okay, so bigger numbers is better. The variables I used, an index variable means I combined several pieces of information. This is socioeconomic development, higher levels of regional income, more education, etc. This is a measure of the demography, the social environment, what is the proportion of the population that is non-Russian. Location, measured by the geographical coordinates of the capital city of the region. Higher numbers mean more to the south and the east. So low numbers mean that they're closer to the northwest. And I wanted to know about support for communism, which would relate to the support for the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and the Red Belt voting in the 1990s. So I wanted to come up with something that would tell me about how many people in each region still had strong support for the Soviet system. So what I did was I went and got the results for each region of their voting in a referendum that was called by then Soviet President Gorbachev in 1991 about whether the Union should be preserved. So this is how many people in each region said, yes, we want to preserve the Union. All right. So the main results here are that ethnic compositions of the regions, okay, again, the republics and autonomous regions are going to be very high on this. All the other regions are going to be low. That matters a lot. That really strongly correlates with democratic values in the public at large. So for some reason, those members of the Federation, the republics and autonomous regions, the people in those republics, in autonomous regions, are answering the survey interviewers by saying things that show, yes, we respect democracy as a political system. Okay? More of the people in those places than in the oblasts and krais. Okay? And again, that stands out as not what a lot of people would have expected. This number up here is positive, fairly sizable, and what that means is that the regions that were more economically developed, that had higher standards of living and more industrial and white-collar development, they tended to have people with more democratic values. This is a pattern found around the world and that's been argued about for 50 years from the work of Seymour Martin Lipset, and it's known as modernization theory, that those kind of economic changes change the values of the people in a society. So that's supported a little bit by this number. Okay. This negative figure says that while holding the other things constant, while controlling for the other things, being closer to Europe gave a region people with higher support for democratic values. And then, not surprisingly, in the places where there was still stronger support for the Soviet Union among the population, just a few years prior to the interviews, then the publics tended not to answer in support of democratic values as much. So, in other words, there are some ways in which the democratic values measure fits with expectations. Okay? But ethnicity is really important, and its relationship to all this is something that we need to explore more because it's complicated. All right, let me now get to the final part of the puzzle. What does all this mean for how people in the regions voted? And then what was the political system like in the region during the 1990s? So I took the upper middle box of that chart and then broke it down into how people voted. Well, let's see here. Or, no, I didn't break it down. So I looked at the correlation between those values, whether a region had lots of people who with democratic values or very few, and then correlated it with how they voted in these two elections. So overall, this number is a pretty strong positive correlation. And a positive correlation means that regions that had a lot of people with democratic values were more likely to give a high percentage of the vote to Yeltsin as opposed to Zyuganov and the other candidates. This is the first round. Okay, as you probably recall, there was a runoff. Yeltsin won in the second round. Okay, so this I took from the first round. The results are very similar for the second round. Okay, so that's the overall relationship, 0.44, positive relationship. Okay. Regions with democratic values voted more for Yeltsin. Well, that's not very surprising because that election in particular, Yeltsin was making a big deal about how I support democracy, we can't go back to the Soviet Union, right? This is if you want to keep Russia moving forward, etc., vote for Yeltsin. Right? It was a lot of it was about that. So it would be very surprising if that was a negative correlation, but it's positive. Okay, that's what you would expect. It is positive in both kinds of regions, both in the ethnic regions is again my term for republics and autonomous regions, in both ethnic and the other regions. Okay. So it's positive in both. Yeltsin's support came more from places where the public was favorable toward democracy. Okay, fair enough. Putin in 2000 was a very different kind of election. Putin had already been president for a number of months at that point, and had become popular, was more successful in prosecuting the war in Chechnya, and was running more as a sort of as a competent leader, competent administrator kind of person at the time. And so it wasn't about democracy in the same way. Nonetheless, there is this small positive correlation. Okay. Regions that have people with more democratic values were slightly more likely to vote for Putin, although it's not a very strong relationship. What I think is fascinating, though, is that if you look only at the oblast Kreis and 2 cities, it's a negative relationship. And not very strong, but sort of surprisingly negative. It's positive here for the republics and autonomous regions. Okay, they're the reason that there's a positive relationship overall. So the republics and autonomous regions reporting higher democratic values are also throwing their support behind Putin. But it's not necessarily because he is seen as the pro-democratic candidate. Okay, so something complicated is going on there. I'm not going to show you the results, but I did also a multivariate analysis. And the importance of the ethnic differences is maintained in that. Okay. You see that the other regional characteristics continue to matter, level of development and other things. But democratic values are really important in one election and not terribly important in the other is the main thing. So the public's orientation toward democracy can be important in how people in the region vote, but it depends on the context. It depends on what the election is being fought about and what the situation in the election is. It's not always the case that that kind of political culture stuff, that kind of political culture characteristic of a region will really be important. But it can be in certain elections. This is the same chart, only now instead of being interested in how people voted in each region, I'm interested in how those public values related to the level of democracy in the region. And again, this is in the 1990s. And I should tell you how I measure that idea of regional democracy. So I use scores, a ranking, for each region that were created from by the Carnegie Foundation under the leadership of I'm forgetting Petrov and I forget the other scholar, but working for the Carnegie Moscow Foundation, and they asked for each region a series of experts to evaluate the region and its political processes on a whole range of criteria. Cleanness of elections, openness of competition, media, freedom, and other things. And they gathered together all those scores and then rated each region. And the experts were asked to think about each region from the period from 1991 to 2001. Okay, so mostly the Yeltsin period. Okay, so that's the referent here. If a region is judged to have a high level of democracy during that period, it's because these experts said that looking at different facets of the political life in that region, it was pretty democratic. In other regions, the experts looked at it and said, no, this is a very closed, non-democratic region, and they gave them scores. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm comparing my scores of the public democratic values to the Carnegie scores of regional democracy. And again, it's a pretty simple correlation. Overall, nothing. Right? That's a very weak correlation. What did I do? see screen saved. So. Well, most of you saw that number before it disappeared. It was 0.0 something. It's very small. Yes.
Maybe I skipped this part of the lecture, but who organized that poll of who organized that poll? You personally or any Russian organization? I mean,
Who conducted it?
yes, I mean, who asked people?
Russian organizations.
Russian organizations, and did they say for people that they were making a poll for an American? No.
It was, in our case, in the Iowa case, it was Wilmir, which is now Bashkirova and Partners. And in the other case, it was the Institute of Sociology of Academia Note.
And how many respondents did you have for each region?
I'm sorry?
How many respondents did you have for each?
Let me come back to that at the end. That's a great question. It's not. Okay. So, I am not too late.
I'm sorry, having a little bit of technical difficulties. The computer discharged. We weren't aware that it was working on the battery, on power.
If only I didn't talk so long. Look at this. Yeah, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. All right. So, for me, it's fascinating. No relationship overall. But actually a pretty strong, reasonably strong relationship among the non-ethnic parts of the Russian Federation, the Oblasti Krai, 2 major cities, right? So those 57 regions, that's a positive relationship. In those regions, having a public whose opinion about politics, whose values, what they thought was important, what they had done or not done politically, right? Taking all that stuff into account, those regions with a lot of those kind of people, they had more open, more competitive, more democratic politics during the 1990s. Okay, so that supports the sort of theory behind studying democratic values, that the public matters, that there's something, that's something that everyday people do or don't do that makes a difference for whether democracy will exist or not. But the region, this is the very interesting thing here. The reason this number is weak is that it averages, these two work at cross purposes. So in the republics and autonomous regions, it's a negative correlation. The regions where the surveys showed the people to hold democratic values are the least democratic regions in the eyes of these experts who put together a lot of information about each region to try to decide in the 1990s how was it democratic or not democratic. Okay, so, that's the puzzle, right? That's really challenging if you think that political culture matters and ordinary people's views of things matter, right? So the sort of story in that theory is that if you have a public that thinks the relationship between the rulers and the public ought to be democratic, then they're going to resist efforts by the elites to close down the political system, to gain control, to prevent other groups from having power, and those sort of things. There will be resistance. And in other cases when the public is looking for other things and doesn't mind having non-democratic forms of rule, then it will be easier for those in power to create non-democratic control. And that ought to really tell us why democracy is here but not there, that sort of thing. Right? So that's the kind of idea behind democratic theory. And if you're comparing across the different parts of Russia, you get this very interesting pattern, right, that actually makes sense in certain regions, but in others it's thrown on its head. And it's turned on its head in among regions where democratic values seem to be kind of high. So, I don't yet want to say that we should never support political cultural theories or the idea of democratic values and public opinion being important in the political life of a country. I don't think that's supported by this. But the relationship between democratic values and democracy clearly is not the simple story of democracy finding a home in places where the public values it. Okay? So we have to go into more detail to keep studying and figuring out what is it that really explains where we see democracy and where we do not. Okay. So I think that's enough, and I hope it's been clear enough how I've gone through this. And I welcome your questions both about how I did any of this, but also if you have thoughts or comments about what it might explain my puzzle. Okay, so thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's open it to questions. I have lots of questions. You have a coefficient in there, which is 0.015. Seems pretty small to me.
Which one? In one of the previous ones?
Yeah,
the regression?
previous one, yeah. Regression.
No,
We go again. Oh, no.
I can get to it. I think it's this one.
There, yeah. Ethnically non-Russian as a proportion of region and populace, with a coefficient very significant, as you pointed out.
Yeah, it's strong. So that the
But the coefficient is kind of,
yeah. So it's small because ethnically the proportion is measured as a decimal, right? So if you go from 70% or 50% Russian to 70% Russian, or non-Russian in this case, right? That's 20 points, so it would make it bigger. And the dependent variable is also measured in decimals, basically, right? From -2 to +1 or something. So that's why you get these kind of small regular coefficients. It's why I like to interpret the beta weights for this kind of thing, because it puts them into more of an emphasis on oomph. And anyway, so yeah, small, but I think that doesn't, clearly in this case, that doesn't mean a low impact. The better way to interpret it would be to look at sort of what a change of one standard deviation means and that kind of stuff. And the beta weight kind of gets at that, but anyway, yeah. So I think that's a real difference.
can we go back to the last slide then? Yeah, yeah.
Or,
No, that
that
one, yeah.
one, okay.
Okay, does this mean that one might call into question the Petrov, Carnegie, Moscow? Is there some
That's it.
is there some data issue there that might be going on?
I doubt it. I remember looking at them when they first came out 10, 12 years ago, and thinking they were pretty correct. And I tend to think that if you get multiple scorers and all of them have some expertise on a region, that somehow they're going to get it more or less correct. And they were also employing some quantitative data on election results and other things. So no, if anything, the danger is that the way I've calculated the regional values estimates are off. Okay, and for one thing, it's a complicated mathematical process I went through. Certainly, it could be that my estimates for each region are not very accurate. But I have the benefit of the fact that the surveys that my colleagues and I did at Iowa, one of the component surveys of this, we actually asked the survey firm to do regionally representative samples from 4 regions. And one of them was Kabardino-Balkaria. And for each of those 4 regions, the actual average on these measures, and our estimated average through the regional estimate process were super close. So, 0.20 in whatever the, let's say one was 0.20, and then the actual one taken from the survey questions was 0.201 or something, right? And so anyway, they were remarkably close. So the estimates that we were able to check on for those 4 regions were quite close. And again, Kabardino-Balkaria, which is the most unusual high case, that comes from the answers they gave to the survey questions. So then you say to yourself, is that because the people who were interviewed in Kabardino-Balkaria were genuinely pro-democracy, but they had no impact on their region's politics? Right? So there's a public here, and they think about things in a certain way, but there's some barrier between the public and the leadership. Right? That would be a way in which democratic values or any other public values do not matter for politics. Let the people think what they want. It doesn't matter. Politics is up here. So maybe that's one reason why we see things like this. Or maybe it has something to do with particularities of certain regions. I mean, I think it's one thing to say Russian versus non-Russian ethnically, but there are really important differences among the ethnic groups in terms of historical conditions, religious beliefs, social patterns, etc., right? So it could be that we need to dig down more deeply into why did they answer these questions.